Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Request you to please keep your phones on silent as we start the next session. Welcome to the session on Catalytic Philanthropy, strengthening the ecosystem for Samaaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar. This session's conversation brings us to the heart of what drives lasting change in India. The ability of philanthropy to act as a catalyst, unlocking collaboration, shifting systems, and strengthening the bridges between communities, government, and markets. Through this session, we will explore how catalytic capital can enable deeper partnerships and showcase actionable pathways for philanthropies and stakeholders to co-create resilient, inclusive, and sustainable impact. We are privileged to have a deeply experienced set of voices leading this dialogue. Bharath Visweswariah is the British Asian Trust's Executive Director for India. He oversees all of British Asian Trust's work in India across their verticals, which is education, livelihoods, child opportunities, and conservation. British Asian Trust focuses on designing and implementing large-scale programs across these verticals with a focus on measurable outcomes. Dr. Shraman Jha is the CEO of the Hindustan Unilever Foundation and the co-chair of the FICCI Water Mission. He is a scholar, water evangelist, and leader in humane systems change. With deep experience in water security, community systems, and governance, he brings a unique perspective on how catalytic philanthropy can support sustainable systems linking communities, which is Samaaj, government, which is Sarkar, and markets, which is Bazaar, through integrated action. Lakshmi Poti is the head of the fashion program at Laudes Foundation, supporting the transition of the fashion industry to one that is circular and inclusive. She is committed to enabling innovative solutions that have a global impact while remaining grounded in local context. Lakshmi has expertise in strategy, philanthropy, and inclusive business, having previously worked with advisory firms like Intellicap, Deloitte, and Ernst & Young. She brings a strong Bazaar perspective to this discussion, helping us understand how markets and industries can align with communities and government to drive system-level change. Mr. Sreejan Dutta is an investment manager at LGT Wealth Philanthropy, leading its conservation portfolio across Asia. He focuses on financing effective and equitable solutions to the intertwined biodiversity and climate crisis, grounded in community stewardship. He brings over a decade of experience across philanthropy, private equity, asset management, and consulting. His work centers on supporting community-led conservation rooted in indigenous and local knowledge, and developing equitable financing pathways that sustain long-term climate and conservation action. The session is moderated by Mr. Nikhil Govius, a senior specialist food systems at the India Climate Collaborative, and brings over a decade of experience in agriculture, development, sustainable livelihoods, climate action, and food markets. His work involves developing and implementing strategies to accelerate climate action in India's food systems, designed around a triple win framework: more safe food, more rural prosperity, and better environmental benefits. We are delighted to have you with us for this important dialogue, and I request the panelists and the moderator to join us on stage.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, Charlene, for the opportunity to moderate this panel. Greetings to all of you all as well. The title for today's session is Catalytic Philanthropy, Strengthening the Ecosystem for Samaaj, Sarkar and Bazaar. And when I was told I had to moderate the panel, the first thing I did was I went back and picked up the book, Samaaj, Sarkar and Bazaar, written by Roni Nilekani. It's a very small book, highly influential. I very would recommend that you all read it. 2 points from that book that really struck me, and I hope that we can sort of weave that into today's conversation as well. First is, what exactly is the role of philanthropic capital? And philanthropic capital, the way Rohini Nilekani has framed it, is that it's essentially a civic resource or a public-spirited investment that should actually go towards helping Samaaj take care of itself, right? So how can Samaaj work with Bazaar, with Sarkar, to actually be a better steward of its own future, of its own present as well? And secondly is that philanthropy is not a one-time donation, or it's not just a one-time investment. It's really looking more in terms of moving away from relief to actual systems level transformation, where you're not really trying to address the symptoms of a problem, but really go into fixing what are the root challenges. So welcome everyone, and with that very, very brief introduction, I'm just going to quickly jump into some of the questions from our panelists. So perhaps, Bharat, the first question to you is, BAT has been one of the pioneers for social finance-led philanthropy. First is, if you were designing a new fund right now, what are the things that would interest you? What would be the first principles of such a fund? How would you get partners to kind of come on board and work together?
Thank you so much for that, and thanks to the WRI team for having me here. Such a privilege to share the stage with so many accomplished people. In terms of the British Asian Trust and the work that we do, you're right, we've done a lot of work in the outcomes-based finance, social finance sort of space. We've pioneered the use of impact bonds in some of these spaces. We've worked on impact bonds in education in a couple of instances, one on livelihoods, hopefully a second one on livelihoods soon. But also, we are just starting to work on designing something in the conservation space, which we are thinking of as a coexistence impact bond. Right? So something that will start to think about what outcomes we can measure and incentivize in coexistence. Right? Essentially, this is a field where we think about sort of what it would take to keep humans and nature thriving alongside each other. Right? Often we find communities that live on the fringes of forests are actually ending up in conflict with nature. They're ending up foraging for firewood, degrading forests in the process, but also endangering their own lives. Right? Because they might come into contact with elephants, tigers, other forms of wildlife, which end up causing them harm. Communities then end up retaliating, causing the animals harm, and so on. Right? So that's one of the things we have started to think about, is how you can end up breaking some of that cycle by looking at an impact bond as an instrument. And to your question about, as we design something like that, what is it that we look for, or what is it that we keep foremost in mind? It's really across all of this experience that we've had with these instruments, I think essentially a focus on the right set of outcomes and how to measure those outcomes really becomes crucial, right? So, and that might seem relatively easy. It's actually really hard when you start to put it into practice. Right? So even on livelihoods, we found questions of how do you measure, the outcomes of a skilling program is not necessarily very straightforward. Everyone has different definitions, especially as you bring together a diverse group of stakeholders. Everyone thinks about it slightly differently. What jobs are you looking at measuring for? Is just getting placed at the end of a job the right metric or not? Right? So sort of diverse perspectives on even a relatively simple topic like that. I think as you look at the conservation space, it starts to become very complex very fast. Right? So are you looking at very long-term outcomes, such as restoration of forests, which may take several years to sort of take effect? Or are you looking at something more measurable in the short term? Right? So I think those questions end up taking us the best part of several months to actually design, to bring in diverse views across a group of stakeholders to actually figure out what the right answer is. And then it's equally important to spend time designing this question of how do you actually measure those outcomes. Right? So effectively measuring them, again, is not at all straightforward. With skills and education as an example, again, those areas can become really complex quickly to make sure that, an offer letter, say, in a job space is actually what it claims to be, and it's not something that's just made up, right? So it might be a trivial example like that. But in the conservation space, I think even knowing how to measure some of the outcomes that we are thinking about is not trivial, right? And as we've been thinking about the coexistence impact bond, we've been thinking about whether it's going to take new tech for monitoring and evaluation. Does it require new forms of cameras, which aren't even being used on the field at the moment? Are those the kinds of things that it will take to actually effectively measure some of these outcomes? Right? So I think those are the big areas that we've been thinking about. And I think why that's important to us is, as you look at the amount of money that's going into programs in these spaces, I was hearing the figure thrown about that, we've spent about $100 million as CSR funds on tree planting. Right? Have we really gotten enough bang for that buck? And if we are not really measuring outcomes, we don't really know at the end of the day. Right? And so that's what animates us. That's what we believe, if we keep those outcomes at the heart of our programs, and if we design for those, that's what success will sort of end up looking like. So yeah, that's...
Thanks. I'm really glad you brought up outcomes, because I have a follow-up question for you, which is not scripted, is that in your outcomes, do you plan for failure? Because I've worked in implementation programs all my life. I'm very proud of all of the failures that I've had. I can tell you that I've perhaps not built a single successful program in my life. I've only built failures. So in your outcomes, how do you accommodate failure? How do you accommodate course correction to perhaps make sure you don't fail again?
It's actually, it's a great point, because I think one of the features of the impact bonds that we have run has been exactly the fact that because you're collecting data on a periodic basis, it allows you to understand where you're going and therefore to course correct when you need it. Right? So if you think of the typical program, you might think of a long-term program, you might say, look, we are setting out to achieve this over a period of 5 years. Right? And you might only do you might do a baseline, midline, and all of that. But you truly know your results only at the end of somewhere around that 5-year period, right? By which point it's, of course, too late. And you might say, look, I missed my targets. I had a bunch of great lessons learned, but the fact is that I didn't achieve what I was setting out to achieve. Right? In my mind, one of the best features of these impact bonds and the way that they work is that you have periodic data that you're collecting, which then you can look at on, let's say, a 6-monthly basis and say, oh, look, something's off here. If I look at my log frame and I think of the intermediate outcomes that I needed to achieve to be able to get to my long-term goals, I'm not quite getting there. And that allows me to modify my approach, pivot, essentially, and to start to pursue other objectives. So, yes, I don't know if we'd necessarily, I suppose that there's a lot of sort of testing and learning and therefore fast failing, as opposed to saying at the end of the 5-year period that, look, we failed and we didn't meet outcomes. So that, I think, has been a feature for me of all of the impact bonds we've run.
Thanks, Bharath. I'm just going to quickly move to Dr. Jha. So, Bharath mentioned something about the interconnectedness of people, nature, technology, and if I were to add, market, state policy, finance as well. How do you actually build better conversations and collaborations between these two things? And how do you also make sure that these collaborations last over all of the different risks that we're seeing all the time, right? Electoral risks, market risks, climate risks. How do those conversations stay for a while?
How do we build conversations? First and foremost, by continuously initiating and being in conversations, and being in conversations with folks whose views might be substantially different from our limited perspective to life. One person in the room with whom possibly I've had most animated conversations is Anirban right here. Because his experience, his enrichment, and so most of us, those who come from the corporate side, we have our own set of biases. There are people who've spent their lifetimes on the other side who have a better sense. So conversations can only happen and continue if they start and there's a lot of listening involved. I think there's an acceptance that each side has certain constraints, limitations, perspectives within which we have to work and operate. For example, if there's a log frame kind of thing that has to be used, it has to be used. Should it be the only metric? Perhaps not. Then what else and how do we live with it? So the ability to assimilate a diversity of views is vital. The second bit is right, the term that you have, catalytic. Go back to the chemistry. What is a catalyst? It sets off a reaction and then it disappears between two other things. So your job is to be able to initiate that, and then the bigger set of actions and reactions take up. In a country of India's diversity, when our social issues are so different, our geography is so different, and therefore even the way we define problems are so different. Brute copy pasting will rarely work. Maybe it will work if things are very, very similar to each other, but I would tend to say those will lead to more simplistic solutions rather than simple solutions. So the ability to be able to see and accept the differences becomes a starting point, and the frequency of conversations, the honesty and intensity of conversations are probably the most viable part, without necessarily agreeing or accepting. That, I guess, would be the starting point.
Thank you. And I think in the previous panel, there was actually a really good point made by Satyendra, and I struggled with it as well. He was like, we make business decisions face to face. We're not making them digitally, we're not making virtually, because there are some gaps there. So we're now all in this post-COVID world. I work remotely. So how do you really kind of have conversations despite all of these digital, physical challenges of people not being there in the same room, Indigo flights getting cancelled? How would you frame that conversation still happening honestly despite all of these logistical challenges?
The best conversations and the best relationships are built face to face. There might be a stage once that has been done that you are able to do it electronically in some form or the other. I'm a great lover of train travel, for example, and I think that gives abundant time and exposure to kind of get deep into it, or even long walks through the field when you are actually in areas that we as city slickers have very little clue on. But yes, I mean, if the most preferred solution doesn't happen, you look at a plan B, plan C, whatever else it is, and once the mission is there, then if there's no Indigo flight, we take an Air India flight and we move. So life moves on.
I just want to flag that the Air India flight was 6,000 rupees more expensive, and I tried applying for Tatkal and there were no tickets, so I had to fly Indigo. Anyway, I just want to bring Lakshmi in here. Your work at Laudes is bringing multi-stakeholder structures. You'll have a platform, the regenerative, production landscape collaborative. So how can these market-led transformations really bring both shareholder value for people who are investing, but how can it also bring stakeholder value for people that matter the most?
Yeah, so a little bit of a mouthful, regenerative production landscape collaborative. So I'll just call them production landscapes for the purpose of this discussion. I think market-led transitions, what we've learned in the last 10 years at Laudes, working deeply with farmers on the ground, producer organizations, but at the same time, the market, the brands on the other end, and the supply chain in between, is that the transition will only happen and is, impactful if it goes beyond compliance and certification as well. So yes, certification as a core is good, but then how do you go beyond? And I think this goes back to something Dr. Shraman just said as well, on how do you understand what you're solving for? What's unique about that particular challenge? So the production landscapes that we offer support to and partner with organizations like IDH, GIZ, and WWF are in India, Pakistan, Tanzania, and Brazil. And within these countries itself, the regions are so diverse. So really understanding where the place is, what the region is, and then bringing market to understand the needs and then solve for that, I think unlocks the largest impact. So in terms of the transition and what we've seen in the production landscape, so this is really a shared platform of farmers themselves, the government, the local governments, the brands who procure cotton or wheat, pulses, etc., whatever the commodities are in that region, and other sort of civil society organizations that work there. So this opportunity to bring everybody around, creating that shared agenda is so, so important. So what might be maybe a deforestation problem in the Katinga region in Brazil may look very differently in a Madhya Pradesh on this side of the Narmada. So how you lead this market-led transition and how you incentivize the farmers at the end of the day to be stewards of the environment, of nature, of soil, that depends on what you're paying a premium for. What are you incentivizing? So for example, our role as we see it as philanthropy really is to catalyze in that we bring the stakeholders together. There's a fail-fast approach as well because everybody's sort of jointly defining what these shared indicators should be of success across production, protection, inclusion, as I borrow from the IDH framework, or the climate, nature, people angle. But in that larger impact framework, what are these indicators? How do you actually understand this? I think this was discussed in the last panel as well. There's not really today a common or shared understanding of what these metrics mean by the market on the one hand, and what's in it for the farmers on the other hand, or how the government is looking for this. So really, in terms of unlocking the maximum stakeholder value and shareholder value, the landscape allows for sort of efficiencies, shared risks, shared accountability, and really lowering the cost of the transition that we're all seeking to gain at the end of the day. So, yeah.
Thanks. Just a very quick follow-up to that. I think, again, going back to the previous conversation, I heard a lot of markets expect volume, markets expect quality, markets expect this. Can there be an alternative future where markets actually are responding to farmer collectives, where the farmer collectives are like, we have this quality, we have this quantity, tell us a fair price or give us some sort of fair solution that works for us. So is that more of a reality, or is that maybe 15 years down the line?
Yeah, I think realistically, it's going to take some time to get there. But again, with this shared understanding and understanding what the challenges are and demanding for something that's not going to be feasible because you don't understand how it's produced on the ground. So step one is really, moving away from working with isolated supply chains. So a brand working with its particular supply chain and then that's it. Versus moving to a landscape model where there are multiple brands, this collective of brands, collective of market, working with a collective of farmers at the other end, or the producers, is really the, one of the critical aspects that need to change if we do want to see how you respond to that. So the volumes, quality, these are going to be things that will, the market demands. But being sort of responsive to how these seasonality changes happen, or being just closer to your tier 4 or producers is something that can change also the market dynamics slowly but surely. So, just a very quick example. In the work we do in Tanzania, for example, there's a lot of the market-led approach that's led to the governments there changing up the agroecological policies that have now provided incentives and a change in the way the farming methods are done. Because previously this was broken. It was, the farmers responding to or trying to squabble to provide that quality, and the brands just always being disappointed because that was never the quality that was available there. But the policies needed to change, and that only was possible with market signals. And so that's sort of, it's all connected at the end of it.
Thank you. Sreejan, over to you. You've been working with a lot of grassroots partners, providing a mix of patient, capital, lots of capacity building for these folks as well. Not just in terms of how do you grow products better, but how do you actually make a successful business. So what are you learning from these organizations that can also make business sense, but that are also driving a lot of community impact?
There are a lot of things that we are picking up, and honestly, when we look at social organizations, the principles of how you run an organization, a business organization, it's quite simple and similar. And what we try to do as funders or venture philanthropy capital providers is we try to provide them patient capital and also try to be thought partners so that we can solve problems jointly. So, this would mean basically how do we build their organizational capacity so that they can affect systems change at the end and solve for problems that led to, philanthropy becoming necessary at the first place. So then the question is, okay, how do you do that? How do you figure out what's your business model like? We always prefer that organizations have a very clearly thought out intention when they start out, and then have a very solid hypothesis and a good theory of change, which would also show them, okay, this is the potential path to scale. And like Bharath was mentioning earlier, if you have something like that in place, you can fail fast, you can tweak, you can improve on what you're doing, and at the end, you deliver something which is quite robust. And then we also try to figure out how can we help on issues such as building good partnerships. We don't think everyone can solve everything. You need to think in terms of who could be a good partner, and sometimes I think as funders or anyone managing any kind of funds, you are working with so many different solutions. You perhaps have a good bird's eye view of who can come together, who can collaborate, and sometimes you nudge it, and that would lead to impact that would be much larger than what a single organization can deliver. So we try to be that thought partner, not just provider of capital, but we want to also roll up our sleeves and jump into the problem, because it's not like, okay, we have given them a one-time grant and we are done. Hence, we have our approach of a multi-year partnership. And the way I am also judged by my own management, I have my KRAs of adding much more value to my organizations than just doing a due diligence and be done with it.
Thank you. Could you maybe flesh out what this capacity building actually looks like for one of your partner organizations?
Sure. For example, we were working with FES on an engagement that we term as community stewardship. So we try to figure out, how do we come up with financing mechanisms that are kind of bottom up. We have heard of a lot of carbon projects and other kind of financing mechanisms. They're kind of top down, imposed by people from the markets who have a certain agenda, people who want to sell carbon credits to investors. So we were thinking of how do we flip that narrative. So we figured, okay, there are market approaches, there could also be non-market approaches. So we helped FES with the research, the pilots, through which they were able to generate evidence that fed into a very successful motion that was passed at the IUCN World Conservation Congress that now recognizes community stewardship and also supports dedicated funding mechanisms, a step that is aimed to unlocking public and private financing to support community-led approaches. So that's how I think we played a catalytic role. You are the sector experts. We will try to figure out who can we bring in. So right now we are working on an engagement which is also a bit market-led. So we try to bring in organizations like a CGEM or a Farmers for Forests who can help them with certain aspects. And of course, they are quite experts at engaging with the community themselves. So there, we're like, okay, you are the experts. We don't need to tell you anything. Wherever their gaps are, we can try to fill in and try to help them come up with a solid solution.
Thanks. If I were to very poorly try and summarize at least these first set of responses, I think a lot of thinking around having well-defined outcomes, how do you measure those outcomes, really about listening to folks, listening to communities, what do they want, how do you initiate and then perhaps step back and let that kind of movement take on by itself, how do you really not work in isolated sections, silos, that's something we're all guilty of doing, but how do you really get folks onto a shared platform that is more substantive? And finally, this thinking around philanthropy is not just providing capital, but also kind of helping you spend that money better to achieve certain well-defined goals. Bharath, if I could perhaps ask you to maybe just kind of respond to Lakshmi's point, which I thought was very interesting, the Tanzania example, right? Is that you have a system where market wants something, producers want something, something's not working there, and then you have kind of a policy push that facilitates a better engagement. So at a very macro level, if you were to think about this from an India perspective, what would be some of the ecosystem enablers that are really needed to trigger larger amounts of capital, larger amounts of patient capital that don't always have a, a 3-year project timeline or a 4-year project timeline? What is needed in this ecosystem to drive more capital flowing towards climate and nature-based solutions for landscape restoration in India?
Yeah, thanks for that, Nikhil. I was definitely struck by Lakshmi's example as well, because I think that in that example, the market signals or the price signals sort of just triggering a response is a very powerful way to sort of make that system work a lot better, right? But I was also thinking about what Sreejan said about the intentionality in some of these areas, right? Because for me, that's where it actually starts from, is someone having the intentionality to say that I am thinking about the system at a larger level and not just thinking about the individual pieces on their own. So I'm not just thinking about this project that I'm doing and the outcomes of the project itself, but I am actually willing to look at that and interested in looking at that bigger picture and saying what is it that might be needed to unlock, right? Because in some cases, it might be better data, it might be pricing, it might be just the information as Dr. Jha was saying earlier, right? The voices from the community that help unlock an understanding of what actually they need. So it could be a combination of all of those things, but I think as long as we are starting with that intentionality of saying we are looking at that bigger picture and keenly paying attention to all of the different elements of it and looking to connect the dots, I feel like often that is what ends up being missing, because we are all just caught up in the sort of the smaller scale. And again, the point was made about collectives and the power that they can have, right? And often the power of a collective is that you bring in diverse perspectives, which are all looking at the problem from multiple elements. And if you facilitate great dialogue, again, as was said, then hopefully you can surface a lot more insights into different ways of looking at that problem, and therefore hopefully unlock a solution. So I feel like, yeah, this data, all of those pieces we can look at as individual solutions, but I think it's just that intentionality and of looking at that bigger picture that's often missing.
Thanks. And just talking about the power of collectives, Dr. Jha, the capacities of community organizations, I don't know the right word, first mile or last mile government extension official who's there on the ground doing that work. Sometimes a lot of our programs really they'll either succeed or they'll fail depending on that capacity of folks at that last mile. So how would you really, knowing everything that we know or things that we don't know also, how do you really build capacities for communities and last mile government extension workers?
See, succeed, failure, there are two extremes, and depends on how you choose to define it. Similarly, data. Data can be quantitative, but they could also be qualitative. There could also be perception. That is also a data point. So where we choose and how we choose to assess is a very important point. I think the very fundamental part is, what are we trying to fundamentally solve for? And maybe Kareena Kapoor can teach us a thing or two. For those of us who have watched Jab We Met, the movie. Goes back about some years back, stranded at Ratlam station, a nice rom-com. And I picked this example because our broad area that we work in is on water security. And she has a line, when you are really thirsty, pani to pani hai, tab cola shola kuch nahi, mane pani chahiye, when you need it. So if this entire set of stakeholders, if we have that big sharp picture that what are we fundamentally solving for, whether we should get completely stuck by some of the fine definitions of what we started off, because even in a 3.5 year program, it's unlikely that whatever you imagined in the beginning is what will necessarily hold true across. If it's just a matter of meeting targets, everyone will choose to be ultra conservative. You will not want the stretch, because otherwise you'll say in the failure and success paradigm that I have failed. But is that better, or is taking a very soft unquote target and saying how we have exceeded it? So many of these questions are actually matters of trust and faith amongst the stakeholders and among the collaborators that we have to move out of a judgmental kind of sense that we are here together, we are all playing different roles towards trying to make a specific aspect easier. And I think that becomes fairly critical in particularly the social impact domain, that the conversation is continuous, the bigger picture is not lost sight of. Yes, sometimes you will have a tailwind, sometimes you will have a headwind, kuch to hoga. Yeah, it's impossible that everything works exactly as we originally planned. It doesn't happen in the real world.
Oh, excellent. I think just adding to your point also, one of the challenges that, coming from the implementation side, we used to always face is that you're designing proposals, you send it to the funder, funder's like, okay, no, this is not right, change this, change that, change this, address climate better, address mitigation better, address adaptation better. And the key principle that I would always keep is, and I would always convey this back, is let perfect not be the enemy of good. Change is slow, change is incremental, you want to do things at a piece by piece basis, and yes, we have the larger goal in mind, but I really thank you for kind of bringing up that point that there's a larger vision and change is kind of slow and incremental. Lakshmi, I want to kind of bring you in here from the industry perspective. Of course, markets can, like philanthropy, also play a super catalytic role. How do we really get value chains to work for people, in terms of incomes, livelihoods, nutrition security, but also value chains that work and that push towards more regenerative and climate positive models?
Sure, and maybe just quickly before I go there, I think just also responding to Dr. Jha in terms of the fact that not everything you plan for goes, perfectly as planned. At Laudes, actually, we've begun to use something called the rubrics framework, so moving away from, say, traditional log frame structures to rubrics, and I'd be happy to share more with other philanthropies in the room as well, because it's really setting with our partners a longer-term vision. And saying, well, this can affect this, but can make a change elsewhere. But when you report to us, which is once a year, tell us your story both from a quantitative and qualitative aspect, keeping this larger vision in mind, because so much can change through the year even. And that's actually allowed, I think, us to have more candid conversations and course corrections through the year, because the partners aren't held to, a particular metric and you fail or you succeed, right? So anyway, that was just a quick point on building on Dr. Jha. So yeah, in terms of industry and where, it can sort of step in and the sorts of models that can work. Again, I think coming back to some of these landscape sort of examples I gave you earlier, it's where the sort of long-term offtake commitments, of course, that everybody understands, right? The more secure commitments, then your producers are going to be able to see that and there's a line of sight. But it's a very difficult path in reality, because if anybody has to also commit to a particular area, to buy from that area, they need to also have that sort of trust and, understanding that this is going to come to them at a particular time, there's going to be consistency in the supply chains. Consistencies, in reaching those consistencies, will require your policy and investment and community interventions as well. So let me give you an example of actually what we've seen. 10 years ago, we supported, amongst other civil societies, ASA, Action for Social Advancement in Madhya Pradesh. Excellent work with organizing farmer-producer organizations, professionalizing them, and that's sort of what they did, and engaging them on what markets require and need, etc. That has now evolved into something called Plowman, which ASA has set up as a complementary organization which provides market access, but also information back on seeds and other things. So it's a trading organization, essentially, set up separately, with serving 100 plus FPOs on the ground. And that's taken time, because that required a lot of working hand in hand with the market, with fashion brands, with food brands, with wheat and paddy brands, to understand what does the market really require, and taking that back to the farmers and the farmer producer organizations. So it's not so simple as just to say it's the offtake, long-term offtake commitments that matter. It's really getting your hands dirty in working through the supply chain. They're also now setting up processing and ginning facilities because that's really adding value. But that comes up and the farmers trust to do that because they see a market at the end of the day. So it's really the, sort of sequence of events that happen. The role of philanthropy there, and I think where others can also join in terms of landscapes, is different philanthropies have different agendas, right? So for example, the Unilever Foundation may come in with a very sharp focus of water. Someone else may come in with, processing and food loss, food waste. The landscape allows for that because it's essentially a jurisdiction. So you're saying, okay, this is a 100,000 hectare jurisdiction. Everybody is welcome. Let's share out or impact at the highest. How you get there and how you work with the communities then can be more targeted. And that's where markets coming in also helps. Because at the end of the day, you need offtake and you need, sort of markets to pick up the product. So I think that's really where I would talk about business models that have worked. And I think one last example is just the Organic Cotton Accelerator. Also work in these landscapes that we've talked about, but it's a collective of brands who source organic cotton. Again, those market signals are so important. So there's about 16 million euros that's been unlocked as premiums over and above the market rate for cotton today, because there's been targeted sort of also a shared accountability of the brands working closer with these farmers at the end of the day. So that partnership model really works, but you've got to be really in the weeds to do that sometimes as well.
Thanks, Lakshmi. I really like the landscape idea. And in the post-lunch session, Min is here from Agroecology Fund. He'll be talking to you a lot about, how landscapes and doing this level of integrated approach is actually what is more likely to, deliver results for people, for planet, and also returns on investments. Sreejan, if I can come to you very quickly. So for philanthropies, I always hear that, pilots never scale. From an implementation side, it's pilots never fail. And eventually all these pilots get stuck in this valley of death. You work for 3 years, funding gets over, funder moves on, and you are left with, this, yes, you have some of the answers, but you don't have all of the answers. And your staffers move on to other organizations, and you're kind of stuck somewhere there. So how do you really help organizations go from this pilot to more jurisdiction or landscape level, movements? What does that pathway look like?
Yeah, I think some of it we already touched, like I was mentioning. Even, scaling starts even before you start a pilot. You need to be very intentional about what you plan to do. Of course, there will be a lot of learnings, and success and failure is like quite a wide spectrum, but at least you have some sense of what you want to achieve. Then, like having a theory of change or the framework that you were mentioning, that would kind of point you towards where you want to go, what would be the potential path. And once you have these things in place, then you need enablers at different stages. So let's say you're an organization at the pilot phase. There you need 3 important things. Most importantly, you need deep community engagement, because you want to ensure that whatever you're working on is inclusive, it's workable on the ground, and you build community legitimacy with the communities. Second, you need some flexible and patient funder partners who are not just funders, but also thought partners and help you solve problems. And third, let's not underestimate the power of a small and dedicated team. They will really help you take off your pilot. Then, okay, your pilot succeeded, you have moved on to the replication phase. Now you need some additional enablers. First, you need to start inculcating partnerships with governments and markets, private sector, because they will be quite critical when you reach the scale phase. Then you need to gain access to accelerators, capacity builders that will help you professionalize your organization, strengthen your operations, put in place systems like monitoring and evaluation, and also give you access to technology. And of course, you need some growth capital at this stage who would help you grow your team, put in place the digital infrastructure, and anything that you need to replicate efficiently. And if you have been successful at replicating and you've moved on to the scaling phase, now, first of foremost, you need those strong government partnerships, the market partnerships that can really help you scale up. For example, if the government can adopt your solution into their policies and regulations, it can go really far. You need support from coalitions and partnerships who could amplify your message. It's not necessary that you need to go and do something everywhere. Perhaps you would have like-minded partners who can take your solution and take it ecosystem-wide. Then, you would need access to the markets, like I mentioned. You would need access to perhaps partners who can help you set up financing mechanisms like a payment for ecosystem services, carbon credits, outcome-based funding, so that you can go away from philanthropy and look at more durable financing flows, ensure your own sustainability. Media would be a great tool as well, because they will really help you build your narrative. So this is not an exhaustive list, but I think these are some of the key enablers that you need, depending on what phase you're at.
And thank you, that was really well articulated, and I like the sort of different things based on which part of the journey you're at. I just want to now take some time to open up the floor to questions. Just a reminder, please keep your questions brief, and please use this opportunity to ask folks who are experts on philanthropy, experts on funding. Any specific questions? Yeah.
Hi. So first of all, thank you for this wonderful discussion. Okay. Sorry. So thank you for this wonderful discussion. My question really, I think what Lakshmi had pointed out, that there are different philanthropies who focus on different aspects of a landscape, whether it is water, and you talked about coexistence, bonds, and so on. So we often have consortiums and coalitions between non-profits to achieve a certain goal. And I wonder, are these conversations even at a philanthropy level, where philanthropies themselves are having consortiums or coalitions thinking about a specific landscape? And that allows different people to bring in these different perspectives into that landscape, and then enable through the existing CSOs on how they would think about that landscape. So just a question back to you on consortium between philanthropies, and is that something that has been explored as a model, and what that would mean?
Sure, maybe I can start, and Dr. Jha, you'd want to after that. Okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, yes, there is a lot of, consortium building amongst philanthropies. So India Climate Collaborative, for example, brings together a lot of philanthropies, and Laudes Foundation, we support ICC. There's similarly others globally as well, like Philea and other sort of collaboratives working on this, or what the Climate Works Foundation brings together as well. So there are sort of different groups and platforms where philanthropies come together, where they're aligned, where, if it's agriculture, if it's, energy, there is also like at a meta level, other philanthropy sort of collaborations as well. And besides these platforms, of course, we're in constant conversations with each other, because there are a lot of partners that we share. So when you don't want to duplicate, you want to take it to scale. So how do you complement the best way? So that's a constant conversation that we do have as philanthropies. I think I just want to add one thing. I think what's unique in the sort of landscape approach of thinking as well is, while philanthropies can sit together, who are we actually sort of supporting at the end of the day? Whose voices must really be lifted and included in these conversations? And that's where this sort of a platform, bringing farmers or the communities along with the government, because there's a lot of public finance that can be unlocked to reach scale, and they need to also be part of these discussions. And when they are there in the shared design phase as well, then there's probably a better likelihood of reaching scale faster as well. But Dr. Jha.
Thanks, Lakshmi. Can I build on that? Because I think you raised... See, as somebody who spent a good 30 years on the business side of life, and the word you hear most often is competition. The nicest thing I find about being on this side is that there's no competition, everyone is a collaborator. So you can speak peacefully, and everyone. Yes, there are constraints. For example, if you were to look at India, within these formal CSR framework, there are rules, laws, there are reporting formats, etc., etc. So each corporate needs to report separately. You have to look good in your annual report. There are constraints. But having said that, increasingly the funders are also talking formally, informally. Just to give you one example, we had a formal convening of funders who are engaged on the behavior change side of agriculture and on water-related practices and so on. And just to see, look, what are the kind of things that we are trying to drive for, and what are the others trying to do, and see, is there a meeting of minds, and how can we unify and choose some best practices so that it become common across more practices. So is it immaculate and perfect? Possibly not. But is it moving in the right direction? I would tend to think yes. But then it's not a perfect world, so there would always be some other dimensions to it.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. So, just I wanted to ask you one thing. Hi, everyone. Thank you. This is Shweta. I work with WRI India. I just wanted to ask you a question, if you can help me understand, what can be one or two key factors or aspects which catalytic funding can really address to be able to initiate or mobilize a long-term action or interest from the Bazaar side. So what can we really, target our efforts towards to get Bazaar more on board for landscape restoration of us?
Sure. Okay, maybe I take off. You want to go first? Okay. Yeah, so I think in terms of catalytic, and I perhaps touched upon this a little earlier, it's really being able to, where there's no one brand or one market player or one supply chain actor that can solve sort of structural barriers together, bringing a collective of these market players together so that they can then signal that this is what they want to procure, this is where they want to procure, and work with then the stakeholders who are outside of their supply chain. So, so like I talked about, the policy and communities, this is outside. Building shared data and impact indicators, which is actually very, very expensive if you were to do it farm by farm or, in an isolated way. But having a collective of brands saying, okay, let's do this because we need the data at the end of the day for transparency and regulations, etc. How do you build this sort of shared data frameworks, shared impact indicators? This is something no one Bazaar player, for example, would be able to do on their own, right? Because that's not their sort of core business as well. And that's really where philanthropy can come in. And I think the second is, again, coming back to the importance of communities. I mean, just to give you a statistic, about 1.7% of climate finance, and this goes back to your previous question as well, reaches smallholder farmers today. Because it's such a fragmented, disaggregated ecosystem when you look at the agriculture field. But when you come in with a market-led angle, there's a possibility to unlock a lot more, because then you actually are able to build institutions and agro-enterprises. This is all in the supply chain. What we, I think, often tend to miss, and the Bazaar players at the one end forget, is that it's not just buying from the, the beginning of the chain. There's a whole sort of chain that needs to be built up for them to receive the commodity and quality and the price parity that they want. So really the role of philanthropy, to sum it up, is to create enablers such that this entire chain can be looked at, that no one Bazaar player would on their own.
If I may add, what is the biggest thing holding back anyone from trying to do anything new? It's fear. Fear of failure. It could be money also, fear of losing money. In the commercial world, there's a term, when a company comes up with a new product, they typically test market it. Does it work? Does it not work? And based on that, they decide whether it can live on its own or not. I think the role of philanthropy here is to take away that fear factor, to allow for that room for experimentation, to allow that the concept in all its dimensions or that are related, as Lakshmi just pointed out, that all of them are working. And if it looks if it's working, that if it's something that can sustain, Bazaar needs fundamentally one thing for it to work. Everyone in the chain has to make money. Then it will work. If that can get established, and that is what philanthropy can test it out, then its ability to roll on its own, to expand will, because then that risk and that fear is taken away. And that can be a great starting point, and then it will roll on its own.
Yeah, also, just building on your point, and speaking from the financial markets perspective, at the end of the day, you also need to look at sustainable financing sources beyond philanthropy. So, philanthropy can also help you catalyze these results-based financing, carbon credit projects, etc., that can really help you set these things up. And like Dr. Jha mentioned, we can also de-risk it, because it's the rarest form of capital that's available out there, and you can take the best risk and the best bet with it. It may lead to certain failures, but I would actually term it as certain learnings, then which could be adopted by others, and then it could be improved on, and you can set up these different financial mechanisms and unlock more funding for the work we are doing.
Yeah. If I can just add quickly to that, I mean, in some of our work more recently, we've been thinking about specific value chains. And we found that that's a helpful starting point sometimes to your point about, where do you begin? If you're picking up a value chain, then I think to many of the points that have already been made, you can start thinking from there to say what is missing, what needs to be unlocked, and therefore what needs to be built. But yeah, that could be a helpful starting point when you're thinking about a journey that needs to be made. At least, yeah, in some of our thinking, we've found that to be helpful. Honeybees, there's like 100 different things that one could think of. But yeah, that's probably a helpful starting point for many.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Hi all, I'm Srishti Arora. I'm co-founder of AgriPortal. So we are an agri-tech startup. We work a lot with tea plantations in South India, both large and small. So since we are talking about the impact of Bazaar on the philanthropic work that happens, in our experience, we have seen currently the situation of the tea industry. They are a bit disillusioned with the markets because the tea prices are not moving at all. And since we have Unilever right here, I thought I'll direct this question. Philanthropies can only do so much to help out, but as Lakshmi rightly pointed out, the signals need to come from the market. So what are your thoughts on, these kinds of long-standing situational problems in the industry where they're kind of losing hope in the markets, and if the prices would even go up or change, even if they adopt good practices or even if they adopt more sustainable way of farming, is it going to be rewarded by the markets at all? So that is a very big question, because the farmers which we interact with, usually they don't even put in the chemicals or put in the effort into their tea farms because the prices are stagnant at 13 or 14 rupees per kg, which their local bottling factories will pay them. They don't have a direct connect to the final buyer at all. So how do we address those issues? That was one question I wanted to get your thoughts on.
Dr. Jha, if you want to answer this question, but I have actually I'm not the person you want answering this question, but I will just say one thing is, this is my take on it, which is that any industry player, however sustainable and equitable they would like to be, will not be able to drive sustainable change if market forces, and by market forces I don't just mean the pricing and the activities of 2-3 other players, but whether the larger political economy in terms of policy, community, aggregators, that entire value chain also supports that industry in wanting to do better for producers.
Absolutely.
So I very rarely think that tomorrow Unilever or any other company decides, okay, we will offer 10 rupees extra per kilo of product. It will work for 6 months, and then the profit and loss sheet happens, and then they're like, okay, we have to go back. So unless it's that larger market change, and I think Lakshmi brought up this point, right, is that you have policy that enables this traction and movement, then you will actually see industry stepping up more. Otherwise, one or two industries by themselves,
Yeah, it won't.
all you at back should be able to create is one or two small pockets of excellence, but that don't really go and create that level of sustainable change.
Yeah.
I don't know, Dr. Jha, if you want to add something, or any one of the panelists.
I mean, for the markets to work, finally the principles of marketing that are taught on the commercial side, that has to come into play. So there is something that the consumer wants or is willing to pay for. That has to get either done or expressed in a particular form. It's no different from your choosing to buy a particular brand of shampoo or toothpaste or whatever. There's a reason why you're paying to pay more for that, or for only use that particular thing. So maybe, but that is a better understanding of the different players in the market. And as Lakshmi pointed out, there are multiple players in the market. So when you have to thinking it through, it's not just the producer and the consumer. At the end of the day, if there are the other players also, that also has to be factored in. But that requires, I think, thinking from a commercial mindset, because only then can the Bazaar system pick it up. Because Bazaar system works on positive economics. So that has to be factored in, and then if it works, it works. You see the case that in things like bottled water, there is bottled water which comes from Evian, which people are willing to pay extra. So there's a place for everything, and the way it is the message. So all that has to form a part of that mix. So, but I think the social sector needs to borrow some of the principles of the commercial sector for that to make it work on a long term.
I think I was coming from exactly that point, because if we are able to build those narratives that we are being a bit more sustainable and doing things right for the environment as well as for the industry, maybe those shifts can happen throughout the value chain. So I guess we are on the same page on that. Thanks.
Maybe just to add one quick point, and this is again from just having sat down with a lot of brands on the other side. So I'm not at all an expert on tea, so I don't know how that industry works, but just speaking from a fashion lens, I think one of the key things that we're seeing needing to change as well is conversations at the brand level as well that need to happen between sourcing, their finance teams, and the sustainability teams. Today, those discussions are a little bit disconnected. And so when the sustainability teams do have some sort of projects that they drive and, with the greatest intent, when it comes to scale or commercial scale at the product level, something is sort of falling through. So a lot of partnerships and this is where perhaps philanthropy can also look at, is from a Bazaar standpoint, how does industry show up? Where are these conversations happening even within industry? So there's a lot of partnerships that we're supporting these days that are trying to get a collective of brands, but even in the brands, conversations happening between their sort of CFOs, CEOs, and the CSOs, because that sort of connected discussion needs to also start happening.
Thanks, Lakshmi. This big screen here is telling me that time's up. But before we end, I just very quickly, what's the one thing you are most excited about, and what's the one thing that's keeping you up at night when it comes to thinking about your portfolios, your work with partners in India? Very quickly, one thing that you're really excited about, one thing that's scaring you completely.
I'd say we are very excited at BAT about the outcomes focus, but that is also, on the flip side, it's a very scary thing for many of the reasons that have come up, right? I mean, it holds a clear mirror on where there are failures, what is the implication of those failures, all of those things. The need for sort of constantly changing based on what those outcomes are telling us.
Being a Bollywood loyalist, I will just paraphrase a line from an old song, but it comes from Amar Akbar Anthony, which many of you would have heard. होनी को अनहोनी कर दे, अनहोनी को होनी, एक जगह जब जमा हो तीनों, समाज, सरकार और बाजार. Nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah, I don't think I can top that up. But, but yeah, I think for me, what really excites me right now is the work that we're doing on community stewardship. And when I imagine how people can come together and work on this, make this a common agenda and what we can achieve, that excites me. But at the same time, what also makes me lose sleep a bit is this orchestration, this collaboration won't happen by itself. We really need to make it work, and we need to think through different structures through which we can make it possible. And then I'm sure we can achieve a lot together.
Yeah, I think what excites me the most is in the kind of work that we're doing, that the markets are finally coming in. It's taken 10 years of building it to a level where the markets are now coming, and this is exciting because I think philanthropy can then now crowd in more philanthropy as well as institutional and mainstream finance to come in a lot more because there's a business case now. What keeps me up at night, I think, is that the world is getting even more impatient, and just having learned that this absolutely needs long-term, patient, and sort of a vision at the end of the day, it does keep me up at night that we can keep the energy going as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Big round of applause for the panelists. Nothing keeps me up at night. I sleep like a baby, so that's just for me. I've just learned babies don't sleep really well, so then I sleep like a cat. Cats sleep 18 hours a day.
Thank you to all our panelists for an exceptionally grounded and insightful discussion. Each of you brought a distinct but complementary perspective on what it truly takes to strengthen systems across Samaaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar.